Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fireside chat. My name is Brien Shoemaker, and I am the Outreach and Education Coordinator for the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And I'm thanking you for joining our chat today. This is going to be hopefully a very interesting and enlightening session. We have a few panelists on board, and we'll be talking about civility and how to communicate civility in the workplace. Before I introduce our panelists, I do want to just give us some information just so we know what's going on. You will find in your, as you look at your screen, you'll see a chat function. And so if you have questions that you'd want to get answered, or you have questions that come up during the chat, feel free to type that question in the chat function. We'll be monitoring that. So as we go along, we'll be looking at that and we'll be able to bring those questions up and discuss them with our panelists. And I don't think we have to worry about muting. I think that's all taken care of. Perfect. And so the only thing I'd ask now is just kind of for the panelists to introduce themselves. I'll go first. Again, my name is Brien Shoemaker with the EEOC. I've been with the EEOC for about 20 years now, and I do a lot and education for our district, which includes all of Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, and then half of Ohio. I'm going to pass it over now to Tiffany. Tiffany, would you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, my name is Tiffany Hanson. My pronouns are she and hers. I am essentially a marketing and communications professional. I work with Luna Language Services, which is a translation and interpretation company. You can see Naomi. Naomi is one of our fabulous ASL interpreters today. I also work as the Director of Marketing and Communications for Indy Pride. And so altogether, I end up doing a lot of work and advocacy around communication strategies with people of different national origin, the deaf community, so people with disabilities, as well as the LGBTQ+ community.
All right, thank you, Tiffany. And I'm going to now introduce April. April, why don't you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm April Klug. My pronouns are she and hers. I am an investigator with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So kind of in my role, what I do is any allegations that come to the EEOC, I'm the one who looks into those allegations, investigates those, and kind of make decisions based on the evidence that we find in the investigation.
Okay. Thank you, April. I appreciate that. You'll find that Naomi is with us as well. She's our interpreter today. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen. I have a few things that I want to just talk about real quick. And then as I share my screen, it would be beneficial if you wanted to keep Naomi up, if you could pin her to your screen. That would help us and help you be able to see her during this presentation. So I think we can see everything there. So I first wanted to really just quickly talk about the EEOC and why we think civility and communication in civility is important. Why is it an EEO issue? And what the EEOC has found, and you can go to our website, and I would highly recommend doing that, looking at our website on the Task Force on Harassment. What we have found is that the EEOC knows that civil workplaces prevent harassment. And that's what we're interested in doing right now. We're interested in preventing harassment. And one of the key ingredients to preventing one of the key ingredients to creating a civil workplace is communication. And so what we're going to do today is I'm going to briefly talk about what civility is as far as the EEOC is concerned. And then we're going to talk about ways to create and communicate civility in hiring practices, in creating a culture of civility. How do we communicate that to our employees? And then finally, we're going to talk about some best practices for creating a civil workplace. So, the first question we have is, what is civility? What are we even talking about here? And I like to break down civility into basically four things: community, respect, restraint, and consideration. Community is really, if you break down civility itself, it talks about cities, right? Community. And community really is about what are the behaviors that are expected within a certain community. So what are the things that would be acceptable, the behaviors that are acceptable in your community, and what are behaviors that are unacceptable in your community? And those are things that you want to think about for your own workplace, your community. What behaviors are acceptable in your workplace and what aren't acceptable in your workplace. And you're going to start to think about then and define civility in your own way with your rules of conduct or code of conduct. Respect is another thing that comes to mind when we talk about civility. And I like to think about respect as saying to an employee that the work that they do is important. The work I'm giving you to do is important. I respect you enough to give you this important work, and the work that you'll be doing is be helping the company. And there's a mutual respect there. I think that's a nice way to think about civility. Of I'm giving you work. The work that you're doing is important to this company. You're important to this company. The other thing I like to think about is restraint. And most of the time when I say restraint, people think about restraining others. But what I want you to think about as far as restraint, when you think about civility in your workplace, is taking a moment before you act, restraining yourself, so that we have a moment to think about our actions, to take responsibility for our actions, and to think about how those actions will impact others around us. So restraint is key, and it's about restraining ourselves. And then finally, I think most importantly, is consideration. And consider that people communicate in different ways. Genders communicate in different ways. Nationalities, cultures communicate in different ways. People communicate in different ways, and understanding that there will be differences in communication and making sure you have open lines of communication will really help build that sense of community and civility in your workplace. Again, what is civility? Well, it really is how employees behave and communicate within your organization. What are the acceptable behaviors in your organization, and what are the unacceptable behaviors in your organization, and how do you communicate that to your employees, and then how do you hold them accountable? One of the key aspects that the EEOC looks at and has thought about when thinking about preventing discrimination and a civil workplace is this kind of continuum that you see on the screen, where you have a good communication on one end, right? And then you have acceptable behavior. And as you can see, as miscommunication occurs, you can move easily into rude behavior. Rude behavior can move into bullying behavior into harassment, and then harassment into illegal harassment, okay? And that's kind of where the EEOC gets involved. The nice thing about this is that when we develop our communication skills, we can move up and down that line of behavior. So if we see that our organization is becoming, towards the miscommunication, towards the harassment kind of side of things, using good communication and some things that we'll talk about today in just a few moments, we can move us back into the acceptable behavior for our organization. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing this screen so we can see our panel. All right, and I think now we can kind of see everybody. And the first thing I would really like to talk about, kind of throw the question out to our panelists, and maybe Tiffany would be the best person to talk about this, is I'd like to talk about communicating civility when onboarding or hiring employees. And when we onboard employees, what are some items that you hear about that people of a different national origin, people with disabilities, or people from the LGBTQ plus community might experience differently than their counterparts?
So I like to think about communication strategies in both quite literally the language that you're using, in addition to the terminology that you're using. So when we're thinking about onboarding an employee, we're thinking about the very first experience that an employee is going to have with your company. Are they going to be motivated to work hard for you? Are they going to feel welcome? Are they going to feel included? Are they going to feel like they're in an inclusive environment? And with people of different national origin, I like to talk about how comprehension of English is absolutely a spectrum. I meet people all the time who speak enough English to be able to talk about their family or their faith or their trip to the grocery store. But that doesn't mean that people who come from a different national origin or a different language background can understand everything that is in front of them, especially when it comes to thinking about benefits information and all of these complex forms that we may have people fill out, right? So thinking about either translating some of that information into the different spoken languages that folks have, or you can do things like provide an interpreter for meeting, especially when you're talking about having training sessions where there may be some higher level terminology. When you provide those sessions in an accessible way and think about language, what you're telling that employee is, I really care about whether or not you absorb this information. I really care about setting you up for success. And I think that's one thing that people should consider is that, that spectrum of language comprehension.
I was going to say, I really like that because, what you're talking about is communicating to your employees kind of like the expectations and saying, this information is important. It's important enough for me to give you accurate information in a language that you can understand.
Right.
And I really like that because I think that's one key. If you're going to give an employee right from the beginning, a lot of times we have no problem telling an employee what the technical skill they need, right, in order to be successful. But we don't tell an employee what behaviors you need to have within the organization to be successful. And so by telling employees right away, here's our code of conduct, this is important information, this is stuff that I believe will make you successful within our organization, that's really key. And then just as Tiffany was saying, making sure that everybody who comes into your organization can understand that, I think is important too.
Well, and when you think about the deaf and hard of hearing community, many members of the deaf and hard of hearing community can read and write English, but American Sign Language is quite different than written English. And so even doing something like providing, like most people think just providing materials in written English is going to be good enough, but that depends on the English comprehension of the ASL user, right? And then one thing that I like to talk about is like thinking about inclusion rather than accommodation, is going ahead and just providing it for people. So there's a difference between me saying, if you need an interpreter, you need to send me a request and then I'll do extra work to provide it for you. Rather than in the example of our webinars, we're like, we're gonna have somebody there for you. We want you to join, right? So there's also a difference in having something already prepared for someone and asking them to request that to accommodate them. Nobody wants you to have to accommodate them, right? They want you to be prepared for them. So when we're thinking about the inclusive part of that, that's something that I typically recommend a lot for folks too.
I like that too. From an EEO perspective, it's really important to be aware of the needs of the individuals that you're going to be hiring, or in any case, even just interviewing, right? So there are certain things that the EEOC requires that you provide to applicants if they ask for it. And April, I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about, I think Tiffany's point is spot on about the company not having to accommodate somebody, but already having it. But could you talk a little bit about maybe during the hiring process about accommodations and a need for accommodations from an EEOC perspective?
Yeah, definitely. So with the interviewing process, if somebody does need an accommodation during that time period, as an employer, you should, have these abilities to be able to provide those if needed. And with that, if somebody makes an accommodation, you have to also understand and not, shame or, kind of segregate anybody if they do need that accommodation, but rather being able to, listen to the person to hear what they are needing during that process, and then, make sure they feel seen and feel heard with their request by being able to provide that and not making the applicant jump through additional hoops in order to, just get an accommodation to put them at an ability where they can, communicate during that interview.
I like what you said there. You kind of ended with communication, and I think that's really key to make sure when you're during the hiring process for employers to make sure that everyone in the hiring process understands the need to accommodate or the need to provide, as Tiffany was saying, just have that information. Do they have the information that if someone comes in and says, oh, you know what, I need a interpreter, well, then the person that, even if it's just the receptionist, knows that they are able to get that information. One of the things that the EEOC often sees is the breakdown of communication in hiring is that everybody, high up knows, yeah, we know what the accommodation process is. We know about the EEOC laws. We know all this information, but they haven't communicated that to the people that will actually be participating in the interviews, maybe the frontline managers or manning the desks. And so when a person comes in and has a request, those people don't know what to do. And I think that's why communication is so key in the fact that you're communicating your own policies and procedures to everyone within that organization during the hiring process. Great. So where, and Tiffany, I think this would be more for you. So let's say somebody, a business, they're looking to go out and hire some individuals. Maybe they constantly are looking in the same place. They have their routine that they do. This is where we advertise for employees. This is what we do. Do you have any advice for that employer to see if they can get a more diverse set of applicants, or maybe they're looking in places that they haven't looked in before?
Absolutely. So just before we started the webinar, Brien and I were actually talking about virtual hiring fairs. And what you'll see is a lot of nonprofits that serve specific cultural communities are now hosting more hiring fairs, or will actually have job placement services as a part of their programming. So one of the things that I am most proud of as my time working with Indy Pride is starting our Indy Pride LGBTQ+ career fair. It's the first career fair that's been focused on this population in the state of Indiana. And we were really excited to have a large number of, both number and types of organizations participate, and a ton of people who showed up to interview as well. The thing that we did with that job fair was we also provided an American Sign Language interpreter, and we provided a Spanish-speaking interpreter to make sure that we were capturing a lot of different cultural communities within that one career fair. So the quick takeaways would be, one, look for organizations like Indy Pride, Black Expo, the Immigrant Welcome Center, Easter Seals Crossroads. All of these organizations specifically serve some of these minority communities and have people that come to them that are looking for job opportunities. So partnerships with those nonprofits is an awesome way to start. And then just making that your recruitment process is accessible and inclusive. So a lot of folks, the deaf community has a really challenging time just scoring interviews, because if they have markers on their resume, like they went to the school for the deaf or they worked for the school for the deaf, a lot of times interviewers won't even give that person a chance. They for some reason, there's a mental block of how do I communicate with a deaf person. And so one simple tool that I tell people, if you are willing to accommodate language, is in your job descriptions, just put an interpreter will be provided if needed for an interview, and people that speak different languages in addition to the deaf and hard of hearing community. will see that and will see that you're actively trying to recruit them. So just having some of those external markers of some of the work that you're doing internally can be a big action and sign for people to apply and to trust you that you're doing the right thing and you're trying to hire them.
Thank you, Tiffany. One of the things I always talk about when I do talk about barriers to employment is trying to look outside, the box. And this is the routine that you usually do to hire people. Use your community partners, use your advocacy groups. They're there to help and provide you with, because what you're looking for is the best applicants. There may be the best applicants in places you just haven't looked. We did get a question, and one of the questions is, what about the implicit bias in the hiring process after the request is provided? For example, it will cause us with this extra work each time to even communicate with the potential employee if hired. And I think that's important. And you've kind of identified exactly why there are laws in place to prevent this type of stereotyping. And you can see the bias that are involved with hiring people with disabilities, or maybe people with communication issues, or the deaf and hard of hearing. And so my answer to that would be, number one, you want to make sure that you communicate to your hiring officials what the laws actually state. Here are the requirements that you do have to provide these accommodations. And the other thing is, I think more importantly, is to change the culture of your hiring professionals and say, look, we want to hire the best qualified individuals, and they may look different than what you expect them to look like. And that we have these implicit bias. And by understanding our implicit bias and understanding that this, extra work is not extra work, but it's a way to allow somebody who is qualified, maybe extremely qualified, to help make the company better. And I think that's what you have to try to kind of change, that culture. There's a bias called the like me bias, and this is mainly people to have a bias towards people that look like them, that have the same kind of culture as they do. And so that's why you get a lot of these times where you have a hiring manager that says, oh, the minute somebody walks into my door, I can tell if they're a good fit for this organization. Immediately, I've just got this gut instinct. Well, that gut feeling, that gut instinct is probably just your bias. And that's why you end up with a company that looks exactly like the hiring manager. And what I'm suggesting to you, and I think what the panel is suggesting, is that if you look outside these normal realms that you always look at for hiring, and you create an environment that says, our culture wants to get the best qualified individuals, no matter what their culture, no matter what they look like, no matter what accommodations they need, we want the best qualified individuals working in our organization, then that culture is going to always win out. And it takes a while to do that. It takes a while to do that type of thing. So I think that might actually be a good transition, because we're talking about creating that culture. And so I wanted to talk about how do we communicate? If this is the culture that we want to provide to our organization, how do we then communicate that to our employees? And maybe I'll start this time with April. Maybe a little bit of a compliance issue as far as the EEOC is concerned, but how do we communicate some of these policies that you may have to your workforce?
Yeah, that's an excellent point to discuss, Brien. So I think in terms of compliance and how companies should let employees know, that they're creating this culture of civility, is to have routine training, be able to give relevant and specific examples of what you want to see in the workplace, what you're looking for in the workplace, and not only just communicating that to employees, but your managers as well. So with creating civility, you might even look to have separate training for managers, specifically on how to work with employees to make them feel safe in the workplace, to make them feel seen and heard in the workplace. And really establish those interpersonal skills so that managers can go out to employees and make sure, that they're working every day, not just on, compliance, but actively engaging in this culture that overall is a company that you want to see. I think, if there's ever an issue that does arise in the workplace, I think something that, companies could do to kind of reinforce civility is to make sure actions are consistent across the board. So, not treating one situation different than a different situation, but that routine kind of action lets employees know what they can expect from the company and the standards that the company want to uphold.
Thank you, April. I think that's great. That's from a compliance perspective. That's good information. What about Tiffany? What about from maybe a more maybe a non-compliance perspective, since you're not in the compliance field?
Right.
What are some ways that you would suggest communicating civility within a culture of civility within the company itself?
So I have two different kind of types of examples. The first one, super easy, lead by example, right? So one of the things that we see are companies that have employee resource groups for different cultural communities. And what makes those really effective is when you have managers, leadership, C-level executives, directors, when you have our leadership participating in these cultural activities, leading by example and showing your interest in different cultures is going to be one really great way to do that, right? I think it's also, and Luna does this really well. So since Luna hires people that have come from all over the globe, we have all different sorts of backgrounds. They've worked really hard to create a culture of civility where we respect each other, where we want to learn about each other's communities. So they'll do simple things like a lunch and learn, where maybe someone will teach someone Burmese over lunch, and it's just like greetings and things like that. Or my favorite ones, because food is so important, are when they'll actually have someone buy all the ingredients and teach us how to make a dish that they make at home that may be specific to their culture. So it's those fun things where if you create an environment where you're intentionally encouraging people to learn about one another, to learn about how you communicate with one another, and to be respectful of one another's beliefs and backgrounds, then you start to gain more and more people that want to be a part of that culture too.
I like that, and I'll add this, and I think this may get into a little bit of the best practices, which we're going to talk about in a bit. But it's always nice if you've developed a code of conduct. It's nice to let people know what it is. I mean, you've spent time creating it, coming up with it. It's probably in your best interest to let your employees know what that code of conduct is. And you can do that in the best way is communicating that either through writing, which is the best way to do it. And, since not everybody is able to read English, right? So you want to be able to communicate to all employees. We've just been talking about that. So make sure it's not just in one language, that it's in a language that that people can read, more than one language. And then you bring it up frequently. Make sure people understand that the code of conduct, we've worked hard on it. This is what we expect from our employees, the behaviors that we expect from our employees, the ones that are acceptable and the ones that aren't acceptable. And just communicate that to your employees in the different ways that we've talked about communication. Because then you'll have not only kind of what Tim's talking about as far as here's some new ideas, this is why we're embracing different cultures, but you're also going to get some of what April was talking about as far as these compliance issues, that you want to have things written down, you want to be fair about it, you want to do things consistently. And if you have that code of conduct, great, that's perfect. That way you can always refer to it. So I thought that's great. Those are some nice ways to communicate that civility in your company culture. And since I've kind of already talked about some like writing them down, I'm going to go back to April and say, April, what kind of, from an EEOC perspective, what are some best practices for employers that they might be able to that they can ask their employees or their supervisors or managers to do?
Yeah, definitely. So I think with, and again, I'm kind of speaking from a compliance perspective here, making sure that policies and procedures, as Brien just elaborated, are clear, that they're easy to understand. As Tiffany was speaking about earlier, make sure that, if you have a diverse workforce, making sure that all policies and procedures are easy to understand for each of your employees, no matter what their background is, okay? So with these procedures also, it's good to have reporting mechanisms for if these procedures aren't working properly. So if somebody has a complaint or a report to make, I think a great practice is to encourage people to come forward. And I think how you can do that is when someone does come forward, again, don't assign any shame or any guilt, but rather, be really receptive to receiving complaints. Make sure that, you thank the individual for coming forward. It's a difficult thing to, make a report or something like that. So don't just ignore that, but really encourage people, make sure that they know that it's
April,
safe.
I'll just jump in real quick. I'm sorry, but I just wanted to point out that in the task force report, and I know you know this, April, because I've said it a million times and you've been through my presentations, but 70 to 75% of people that feel that they are being harassed never make a complaint of harassment. So they never complain. That's 75%. And really what you're thinking about, the most likely response to harassment in the workplace is not to report it. And so I think perfect, April, what you were talking about is absolutely correct. When you get something from an employee, it may have taken them a while to get the courage to come up and talk to you about this particular issue. And so perfect. Just wanted to add us to what you were talking about, April. Great. And I'm sorry to step on your point.
Oh, that's okay. And yeah, I mean, that's a high statistic of people who don't come forward when they're experiencing something. So trying to be proactive as a company and trying to look at the reasons why people don't come forward. And I think establishing different ideas on how to, combat the reasons that 75% of people don't come forward, I think is key for an organization. And also one other point that I wanted to mention here is if you do have complaint procedures in place, making sure those complaint procedures are effective. So as management of a company, what you want to be thinking about and maybe even test out is how effective are your complaint procedures. You should be looking at ways to test your complaint procedures to make sure that they're working, so that when an employee does have that courage to come forward, that they're not automatically being dismissed at the front lines.
I really think what that is communicating to your employees, when you have a robust system, a system that is working and that you use on a consistent basis, you're communicating to your employees that this system works, that if you want to make a complaint, that we will take your complaint seriously and we'll look into it. And you're communicating trust to your employees. And that's really what this is, about. And the employees will trust you. And there's that helps with building the civility and maintaining the norms that you want. And so I'll move over to Tiffany now. We've talked a little about the compliance issues. Thank you, April. But Tiffany, what are some best practices that you can think of able to improve the workplace culture to make it more respectful for people of different national origins, of the LGBTQ plus community, even people with disabilities?
So we'll start with the LGBTQ plus community first. I mentioned earlier at the very beginning that I think it's about the actual language that you're speaking or using in addition to terminology. So something as simple as respecting someone's pronouns. If someone chooses to utilize a different pronoun than you would naturally assign them, respecting that and trying to get that right. or using terminology in employee benefits or in company gatherings that maybe aren't gendered. So using the word spouse instead of husband or wife. So, Brien, I'm not going to naturally assume that you have a wife. I'm just going to ask you if your spouse is here, or, you know what I mean? It's like using that language. So you're not assuming that someone has one identity or one orientation or another, right? And that goes the same for employee benefits, thinking about LGBTQ plus couples, where does your paternal leave match your maternal leave? So if I am a gay man and a couple and we just adopted an infant, we're going to need just as much leave as a mother who just had a baby, right? And that's a policy when you're communicating things like that to your entire workforce. You don't need to say our paternal leave matches our maternal leave because we want to accommodate these two people. That policy is actually going to be beneficial to every single person across your company, because what dad doesn't want to spend more time at home with their infant, right? So it's thinking about these things of how does the policy that I have written, the language that it's written in, does that naturally include everyone? Or do I need to change that just a little bit to extend that to more people? I think too, something to think about, we see people from a lot of different parts of the world that also bring their own religious beliefs. And while I don't think that religion is something we talk about very often in the workplace, respecting the religious beliefs of all of your community, all of your employee population is important. I talk to people who are like, well, we don't talk about religion in the workplace. And I'm like, do you have Christmas off every year naturally? Does that happen for you, right? So thinking about how you can start to have more holiday policies to naturally give people time off around Ramadan if they'd like that, or Yom Kippur, whatever that looks like, right? If you're gonna have a policy, well, you get Christmas off every year, can you say you can have one of these 3 holidays off automatically, right? Can you start to be more inclusive when you're singling out a specific group, right? Or creating it so that you're not singling out a specific group and just say everyone gets 5 floating holidays. And so it's those tiny tweaks that are naturally going to tell people that I've thought about you, rather than them feeling like an afterthought. You know what I mean? Something like that.
I think that's great. And I think what you're suggesting too is if a company is feeling right now, they've said, oh, you know what, the stuff that April and Tiffany and Brien are saying are really important and interesting, and I want to create these code of conduct, or I want to create this kind of culture of civility in my own workforce. How do I go about doing that? I think one of the things that you're suggesting is involve your employees. Your employees are going to know what the culture is like, whether, what behaviors are going to be acceptable to them and what behaviors are not going to be acceptable. And interestingly enough, I think it's going to vary from company to company. So you have to involve your employees, right? I mean, you have to make sure that they are involved in that process, because they're the ones that are not only going to know what's acceptable, but they're the ones that are also going to have to live underneath that new code of conduct, right?
Absolutely.
So,
the other thing I wanted to bring up, when you're thinking about people of different national origin, when you have someone who has very limited English proficiency, many companies will have a bilingual manager or supervisor, right? And they'll use that employee rather than a third-party provider to help with language access. And while that is absolutely effective, one thing that I like to preach is really making sure that your limited English proficient employees know that an HR manager, and thinking about this from a complaint process side, that your HR manager can provide you language access without that person, that they can do it on their own. We did have an instance once where one of our clients had a group of people that spoke, I believe it was Burmese, and their immediate supervisor was the only person who was bilingual. And so what they found out later was that the supervisor was not treating the employees well, but they couldn't complain to anybody because he was the only person that could help them to communicate with HR. So really making sure from a complaint process that if you have employees with different language backgrounds, making sure that it's very clear that they can come to you at any point in time, and that you're happy to provide some kind of a third party something to be able to help with language support.
I love that. And April, would you be able to speak for a bit about the effectiveness of a policy if only one person is able to get the complaints, in the example that Tiffany just talked about?
Yeah, definitely. So that kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier of that complaint process not being effective. So when kind of testing out your procedures to make sure that they're working, something to definitely think about is, what if the only way I have to make a complaint about something is through the person that I want to make the complaint about? And so I think definitely, that highlights the importance to have multiple avenues where people can make complaints to different people. And I think it's important with communicating that out to employees is to make sure they know exactly who they can go to. If it's a manager, maybe think about listing different managers' names. If there's a lot of turnover in that position, maybe just making sure to identify, the position to report to, making sure people know where HR offices are, making sure there's multiple ways to access different people as well. So that could be via written complaint, verbal complaint, maybe an electronic complaint if texting, or, if there's employees' computers or an intranet way to kind of make an internal complaint as well.
Excellent. Thank you for that, April. And lastly, what I will talk about, because we're getting close to the end, I just wanted to point out one other best practices for creating this culture. If you're serious about creating a culture of civility in the workplace, one of the things that I would suggest is making it part of the performance measures that you do. I think companies are very, very good at looking at technical skill and then measuring that and giving a performance review on your technical skill, how well you do your particular job. But oftentimes companies don't look at the behavior of that employee. And what I would suggest to you, if you're serious about creating a culture and making sure people are accountable for their behavior, include behavior and technical skill when talking about performance evaluations. And that should be something that is expected of employees. This is the behavior that's expected of them. And when they deviate from that behavior, just like if they deviate from their technical skill in a negative way, then they need to be talked to about that and be communicated to that they're deviating from the behavior that is expected of them. And you can do that in any number of ways, just like you can discipline an employee for their technical issues or problems in any number of ways. I'm going to open it up now to the chat. We have a few minutes left. If you have questions, now is the time to ask them. We can get through some of them before we have to leave. You can use the chat function. There is a question and answer function as well. That's not as effective for me, but I can try it anyway. I see there is a question here. It says, what are ways to keep this information secure? A reason why people may not want to report due to the social backlash from reporting it. If a reporter is not kept anonymous, confidential, if they're not, then and the experience social, oh my gosh, they really are trying to get me to say animosity here in the workplace. What should it be done? So this is really a question. How do you keep these questions confidential? And is there a innate sense of confidentiality in making a complaint of discrimination or complaint of harassment? And I'm going to throw it first to April. April, would you like to take that question first, or do you want to think about it for a second? Okay.
Yeah. So I think, anytime, someone makes a complaint, it's definitely important to keep that information confidential. If you look into this complaint, that could look at, starting an investigation, looking out to see if anybody witnessed this event in the workspace. But with that, you need to be able to make sure that the questions that you're asking, while it may be specific to one person, the person who made the complaint, you could start by asking more general questions, as in, did you see any interactions between different people, not naming, just the person who reported the incident that happened, but kind of list more general questions. And then once you've elicited information from witnesses, kind of then use that to just be curious and whittle information down to maybe something more specific that they witnessed, including the person who made the complaint.
Thank you, April. One thing I would add too, though, is that's all good information. I would caution employers on promising confidentiality, only because you never know what you're going to uncover. And so a lot of times, if you've developed a rapport with your employees, and there's a trust between and your employee, you may be able to talk to them and say, I understand that you want to be confidential, that you're making this in a confidential way, and I can respect that, but there may be a point where I need to do something for your best interest, because you may not be the only person that's being affected by this. And so then I will have to, open and to allow and to make sure that the employee knows that their confidentiality will be respected, but there may be a point when the company is going to have to take action, and they will not be able to be confidential anymore. So yeah, just be aware of that too. And Tiffany, before we go, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Nothing to the confidentiality part of
Okay.
that. I think
Okay.
it's just, for me, the one thing that I encourage people to do regularly is to look at every single person in your life and find something in their life that's different than yours, and just start to learn about it. Like, self-education for me is a big part of my life. And so that's the number one thing that I can tell people to do that is super easy to do on their own. And that will allow you to create a better culture everywhere you go.
Great. I love that, Tiffany. April, any final thoughts?
Nope. I tend to think with civility, I think of 3 words, which I think I've repeated here multiple times, is just making sure that your employees are making sure they feel safe, seen, and heard.
Great. To April, thank you for that. I want to thank everybody for being respectful and attending this webinar today. I hope that that you got something out of it and are able to take away a few pointers and maybe some best that you can use, and get an idea of why the EEOC thinks that harassment prevention starts with civility, and why it's just a good practice in general. If you have questions or comments of me, my name, again, Brien Shoemaker. You can reach me at brien.shoemaker@eeoc.gov. That's BRIEN.SHOEMAKER@eeoc.gov. And you can always feel free to give me a call if you're more interested, or if you're interested in learning more about civility and the EEOC. So I want to thank you all for attending. I want to thank our panelists, and I appreciate it. And thank you.